All right, let's give it a sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan, and returning as a co-host is Xueyi Yao.
Hello, everyone. This is Xueyi.
And we're going to be talking with Neil Cohn about their work.
Thank you very much.
And yeah, maybe we can... Oh yeah, let's do that. Maybe we can just kind of start off with asking you what language is.
What is language? So that's a complicated question. One of the interesting things about it is that people who study language have never really needed to define it because it's easy enough to just say, well, I know what language is. But then you get cases where things depart from the prototype. So people, though it's widely acknowledged that sign languages are language, not everybody's familiar with them, and they're less prototypical. And so then some people go, are sign languages really language? Now, people who study this say absolutely they are, of course, but they are not the prototype that speech is. And then you get further afield with questions like, are emoji a language? Or are writing, is written language truly language, or is that some extra thing? And my work alone has asked whether or not visual representations are languages and have properties of languages. So I think the question of what is language ends up being complicated and in some ways problematic. So the way that I've gone about it is to argue that, well, we know language ultimately stems from a cognitive system that in the brain. And even though, of course, it's externalized and has a social function and a social dimension to it with regard to how languages manifest, the building blocks of language are in the brain. And so you need to, if you're going to define what language is, it's going to be defined by those cognitive building blocks and ingredients. In the same way, my usual analogy is something like if you were going to define the difference between, of what a cake is versus bread, you have to look to the ingredients. You can't simply say, well, this looks like a cake and this looks like bread. You could do that, but of course, you might be deceived into having very bready cake or something like that. You'd be like, oh, actually, as we've seen now from memes online, cake could be anything. It could look like anything. And so what really makes it cake is the ingredients that it's made up of. So if you want to ask what language is, you have to ask what are the ingredients that it's made up of, which is what I've largely tried to do. And we could talk about what those ingredients are. However, at the same time, calling something a language has a social function. And a value associated with it. So oftentimes when people say something is a language versus not a language, they are being either inclusionary or exclusionary in ways that carry value. So if you say something is a language, to many people, that means that it has social value or communicative value beyond just being, say, communication or something like that. So there is a value-ladenness of giving that assignment. And in our recent work where we really do try to go into what is language, we both try to define what the key ingredients are and how they work and how they're combined, and how systems that may or may not be language all use the same underlying building blocks. But ultimately where we end up is to say the phrase language is less important than recognizing the building blocks and how they combine. And in addition to that, because it carries this social value and function, it makes it not useful as a scientific term anymore. So arguing about whether something is or isn't language as a scientific matter is less important than identifying what the actual properties of those systems are relative to each other. And we provide alternative categorization system of descriptions for what those systems are and how they work that is meant to be more descriptive than using the term language. Part of the problem then also is when you have the term language, you end up with just, well, is it language or is it not language? And you get a binary. And our system allows for different categorization in description. And where we ultimately arrive at is to say, you can call anything you want language if you so choose, but you have to be precise in your descriptive terms for the structural components if you're trying to make a scientific argument. So if you want to say that emoji are a language, fine, but you also have to then say how they do or do not use the ingredients that are involved in actual similarly to other languages. So I would argue then, for example, in the case of what I would call visual languages of systems of graphic representation, they have all of the same building blocks, at least in full-fledged what I would call visual languages. Full-fledged visual languages have all the same cognitive building blocks as spoken languages. If you don't want to call that language, that's fine. We have an alternative categorization that is at the same level of spoken languages. And now you have to say that those two things are the same in that category, whether or not you want to call it language. And emoji end up not being quite the full-fledged visual languages in our scheme. But you can call them language if you want. And then you just have to say, well, but they don't have these properties in them. So using the term language as a criteria or a scientific descriptor is problematic. And I don't think we should do it anymore, basically. I think it's not worth doing. And instead, we should be being more scientifically precise with alternative categorizations that actually allow us to describe what the relative properties are.
Yeah, right on. I mean, I'm going to lift this real quick. But it's interesting because I think any time you get a graduated means of measuring any category, you gain so much more information.
Yeah.
Like even if you go from, is significant to actually looking at what the size of the effects are, you just that small addition gives you so much more information into what it is. So this graduated perspective on language, I think, is so informative. So if we could take one sort of conceptual step back, how do you see communication then? Do you see it as language is just a degree of robustness of the communication strategy? Or is it something else? Are they two distinct things?
I think communication ends up being the conveying of meaning back and forth between people, let's say, or communicators, to be general. Communication is about transmission of some sort of meaning back and forth, or just in one direction, depending on how you go about it, from one source to another source. Let's put it that way. Language is a particular type of that, but language has particular structural properties, and that's a difference. Is that language isn't just conveying meaning. Language has structural properties that have various principles that guide them, as do, I would argue, all things that fall into that class. There are other communication systems that don't have that robustness of patterning, let's call it, where you still are able to transmit meaning between agents, or whatever sort of terms you want to use, between communicators. So meaning can be conveyed back and forth, even without the use of patterning and schemas like that. So that ends up being more general. So, but it is worth remembering that languages, or whatever you want to class them as, are part of a broader system of communication. And to some degree, it's very difficult to cleanly tease apart the contributions of what one might call language versus something else in the more creative fashions. But I think it is worth identifying which things have patterned representations versus the ones that are less patterned, or not using some sort of system as such.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I would add that the stereotype of something like visual communication or graphic communication, like what I primarily study, of drawings and whatnot, the stereotype is that there is no system there, that graphics just represent what people see, and it's just a type of perception. And so that's like for some people, they would say, well, it's impossible to have a language of graphics because graphics are an articulation of perception or reflect, whether it's perception by eye or perception in terms of visual concepts themselves, and that graphics are just representations of visual concepts, and thus there is no system there because it means it's entirely idiosyncratic with the percepts themselves. That is an extreme view on what pictures are. It's also completely false. There's no basis for that other than stereotypes that have been developed over the last couple hundred years since post-Renaissance. But once you tease it apart, it makes no sense whatsoever as a basis for how we understand pictures or produce pictures or the range of systematicity that you find across pictures, or even the broader implications of things like, well, if pictures are direct representations of visual concepts, if we were talking about that in terms of language, that would be a very strong deterministic view of language's representation of thought, to the extent that it's like the most extreme Sapir-Whorf linguistic relativity hypothesis, where language completely shapes all the thoughts you have or is a direct reflection of all of the concepts you have. That would be an extreme view with regard to, say, spoken language. But it's the baseline assumption that people make related to pictures oftentimes. And it's just people don't reflect on how radical such a stereotype ends up being. And I would say that's not true. Graphics have the same sort of system of patterns that any other expressive system uses. It just does so in the graphic form instead of the vocal form or the bodily form.
Can you walk us through an example of that? Like help us build the argument?
Sure. So if pictures are purely representations of visual concepts, one, you would expect everybody to roughly draw in similar ways. Of course, the argument is, well, it's a direct reflection of your concepts, but everybody then has somewhat different concepts in their own unique form. Okay, so now you need to explain, one, why it is that within a person they draw systematically across their representations, right? So it's not like a person varies in every single way they draw. They generally draw faces the same way consistently, etc. Okay, now why do people draw similarly to each other in ways that are adapted to cultural conventions? So why is it that everybody who draws like manga draw in this particular way? Then the implication is, do those people all share the same visual concepts compared to the people who draw like superhero comics or cartoony styles or hyper-realistic styles? Are their visual concepts now different as reflected by their drawing systems, right? And what does it mean that these people then draw in this way? Does that mean that people who draw in a manga style have visual concepts that are shaped like manga representations, right? That would be the implication. And or do they see the world in ways that are then translated into a manga representation? That's the implication. Why is it that also, say, blind people can at least have some ability to draw, right? And improve over time, right? If they have no visual perceptual inputs. Now you can say, well, maybe that's just because they're tapping into the visual concepts, even though they can't see. So these are part of the problematic implications of this, right? If you take it to the fullest degree. And there's also things like, why do people improve over time in drawing? Why is it that some people can versus can't draw proficiently? Why is it that people's drawing ability stagnates around puberty when they are not consistently practicing? Is that because their visual concepts are then solidified at that time? There's studies, for example, that have looked recently at children's drawings, and they use children's drawings as evidence of their visual concepts. And what they show is, for example, that, the children become more systematic over time, and they start, for example, developing more consistent representations. And the argument is, well, their visual concepts then are getting more stable. But if you look at what the representations the children are producing in these studies, when you ask a child to draw a flower, why is it a daisy specifically in this particular way of drawing? Why is it that when you ask them to draw a house, it's very specifically a square with a triangle on top with a 4-paned window, oftentimes with a chimney? Why is mountains an upside-down triangle with a zigzag, right? These are not because these is the way their visual concepts are. It's because those are the schematized representations, patterns that they've learned of what I would call a visual vocabulary. And I would bet money that if you were to look through children's books, you would find these exact schemas in representation. So children are exposed to certain patterns. They're then producing those particular patterns when they are asked to draw something, and they're going to be more codified over time because they are coming into further development of their visual vocabularies given the stimulus that they're provided and what they're practicing. It's not a reflection of their visual concepts per se. It's a reflection of the visual vocabularies that they have developed via exposure and practice with given systems. And why people stagnate at puberty is because some people don't receive exposure and practice, or do receive exposure and don't practice, as is the case for most people who are comprehensively proficient at understanding pictures, but not productively proficient. So they can't draw proficiently, which is what they mean by I can't draw. And so you're left with a basic system of, a rudimentary system of, say, ability to doodle and have basic conventions, but you haven't developed a robust system of visual representations, like being able to draw like manga, so to speak, which would be having learned a visual vocabulary. And I would argue, and what I argue in some papers is, in fact, this is exactly parallel to what you get in language development, particularly if you think about the bodily modality. So most people are not proficient at signing a sign language, which is a robust system, linguistic system that has a lexicon and a grammar and all these properties. But you need to have exposure and practice with it to develop further. But whether or not you learn a sign language, you still have the ability to gesture. It persists regardless. And I would say the same argument happens for graphics, is that if you have exposure and practice with a visual language that has a robust representational system, and you do the due diligence of practice and whatnot to become proficient at it, you have proficiency in a visual language. But if you don't do that, you're left with the basic system of whatever it is that you have left over, of whatever cultural conventions you may have learned, which are likely things like the flowers and houses and stuff that are just part of the general cultural basic, what I would call graphic emblems that are not tied to a larger system per se, and your basic proficiency of being able to doodle, right? So that's the basic system that you're left with in the absence of developing a more robust system. That's the basics of the argument.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So then when you're learning a particular modality of a language, you're basically gaining the access into systematicity of particular stimuli. So you're learning the conventions. And my guess would be that as you pick up the conventions, you become better at interpreting flexible interpretations of that. So a child might not understand as clearly a more abstract representation of a mountain, but they understand the pyramid. And then maybe as they understand the pyramid better, they can understand abstraction. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think within any given system, as you learn, let's say, lexical items, acquiring some lexical items allows you better ability to acquire more lexical items within that system or type of system. And so you can scaffold and build on the base that you have to get more, and you can more flexibly use it. So even young children do things like repurpose schemas that they've learned in order to fill gaps of things that they don't know. So one thing that children do, for example, is right at the very beginning, they'll learn a word for something, let's say dog. And they go, oh, dog, right? And now they're faced with, oh, here's another animal. Well, I don't know what that's called. Dog. That's also dog, because dog may at that point either be, well, I have a word for this thing and now I'm just going to keep extending it to these other things, or that phrase is linking to a superordinate category of dog actually means animal for that child, and then only does it become a subordinate category or basic level category once they start seeing names for other things too, right? Oh, that's dog, that's cat, that's elephant, whatever, right? Now they might, and then the question is, okay, maybe they need to then learn the word for animal that subsumes all of those rather than just applying the same term elsewhere. So an example that's given for drawing is, let's say you know how to draw the highly conventionalized way of drawing a sun, which is a circle with lines radiating out from it. That's fairly common. Children learn that pretty quick. It's also used, again, in lots of picture books, et cetera, so that kids are seeing this. Let's say then a child is trying to draw a person, and they don't know how to draw hands or feet. Well, then they might just use suns, their sun schema, because that's spatially close enough to a hand or a foot. So they'll just draw a circle with lines radiating off of it, and they're repurposing a spatial schema that is close enough to the spatial representation that they're trying to go for with a schema that they have. So they repurpose it. Or I'm now, like I've drawn people, and here's how I draw heads on people. Now I'm going to draw a horse. I don't know what a horse head looks like. I'll just draw the person head because that's what I know how to draw as heads, right? So that sort of thing happens a lot with children's drawings. And that's simply using a lexical item that you know to fill a gap where you don't know it until you're able to learn something that would go in that gap.
Cool. Since we are talking about graphics and pictures, I have some questions regarding this. So graphic narratives usually include static images showing events that unfold in time, space, but they cannot show everything. So sometimes there are some omission or important parts, and these omissions we can find in comic books or any graphic stories. And there are studies finding that people tend to generate these bridging inferences because they want to wrap their head around the coherence of the sequence of the pictures, and they find that people's processing time of the end state panel is much longer whenever the beginning or the bridging state panel were missing. And there are also some study, like eye tracking studies, showing that people are spending a lot of time extracting information that are useful for them to understand what's going on.
Yeah,
and maybe people might misreport. They have seen some part, like bridging part or beginning, to just help them understand the coherence here. And I wonder, in your theory, visual language theory, how do you think of this? The memory, the role of memory in visual language processing and comprehension, because personally I'm interested in language memory, how different linguistic structure or the way we describe events affect how we remember it. So I'm just interested in that part.
Yeah, so the bridging inference has been a very common target for studies both of visual narrative and discourse more broadly. One of the reasons why it's been focused in visual narratives is because of early theories claiming that between every panel you're generating an inference, essentially. I don't necessarily buy that strict view of it. I think there's more of a what I would call mapping happening between most panels, and oftentimes this is more constrained by a larger kind of grammatical architecture than just merely suturing together linear sequences of panels. And there's a number of reasons why you need something more than that because of, for example, distance dependencies between panels and roles that are played by panels that give you expectations for how both future and past structures are built and things like that. At the same time, there are bridging inferences that are required. So we've done in my work for many years now, both reading time studies of this, and we've done it with ERPs, so measuring brain responses to bridging inferences. Excuse me. And there's also this work, like you talked about, from other labs looking at doing eye tracking and other reading time studies, for example. So one of the first things I'll highlight before I come on to talk about memory is I have a paper called Being Explicit About the Implicit, where one of the things I point out is that in the cases of when there's events that are not being represented in a visual sequence, and thus it pushes you to create a bridging inference, they're usually marked structurally by a variety of patterns. So it's not just that inferences happen, and inferences are happening all over the place. They actually have structural conditions under which they're being marked to a reader in ways that are saying, here is missing information. Now you should fill in an inference. And oftentimes these are highly conventionalized, and they're usually by choice of the author for using one or another of these different conventions that tell you, here is a panel that is not showing you the information that you need to know, but I'm showing you this instead so that you then use this to draw an inference. So one of these is what I call an action star. So let's say, to give us a grounding and an example, panel one, there's two people facing each other. Panel two, one person reaches back his fist to punch and the other person looks surprised. Panel three, the guy gets punched. In panel four, the punchee is knocked out and the puncher is standing above him. So that's just a really simple sort of outline. Okay. Now let's say you replace the punching panel. So one option is you just remove the punching panel. So you go from reaching back to punch to knocked out. Now you very clearly have to make a bridging inference that the guy got knocked out and got punched, right? So you have to infer that. This pattern is what I would call a peak drop. So where the climactic event happens is what we call structurally a peak. It's a kind of a climactic panel. There's a bunch of diagnostic tests that you can do to show that this has this structural property. And many of the cases where people talk about bridging inferences being generated are simply peak drops. They're simply dropping out the moment in which the primary event is occurring. It's structurally marked as such, and then you are requiring a bridging inference. But structurally, the preceding information and ending information are structurally set up in a way that is going to motivate you to derive that bridging inference of the missing peak. So it's not that it just happens because we're putting information on different places and now we're missing information. If you were to delete the reaching back to punch part and leave the punching part and just the people facing each other in the first panel, people generally would have less issue with that being missing, and it would be less forthcoming of requiring a bridging inference to go from standing across from each other to one person being punched. Now, you know that the action involves reaching back before punching, but it's not something that people would generally think as a heavy need to have a bridging inference for that information, whereas you do need it for the punch itself. So not all information there is treated equally, and part of it is because of the structural properties of the sequence. Okay, you can also now do different things. Instead of showing the punching panel, you can show, for example, what I would call an action star, which is like, if you imagine like a star-shaped flash at the size of a whole panel, right? Now, that star tells you event happens here, but it's completely unspecified what that event is. So you know an event happens at that moment. So that means you have to generate some inference at that moment before you get to the next panel, because a panel is telling you that something is not happening there. But then once you get the further information at the next panel, now you can really think, oh, well, here's what happened. And now I can look back and fill in what I think actually did happen, even though I know that something happened there, right? So there's a variety of substitutions that all involve replacing that key moment with something else like an action star. So another one would be a fight cloud, which is a big poof of cloud with like hands and feet coming out of it or something. That one just tells you fight happens, but you don't know what's happening in that fight. You don't know if somebody's punching, kicking, biting, whatever. It's just fight happens. And then you understand at the end what actually happened in that cloud. Another one is showing a different character in the scene instead of the people doing the action. So if it's two people fighting, instead you show a third person looking, and then you show the knockout. Well, now you know that looking person, which we call an onlooker, was looking at the fight, and that onlooker can have a range of different features that tell you whether or not something happens. So on the one hand, the onlooker might be completely passive, which gives you very little information about what's happening. They might have a surprised look on their face. Oh, so now you know event happened, but you don't have really clues about what that event is, right? So in the case of the reaction, just like the action star, you know event happened, but you have to derive an inference for what might be going on there. One further more explicit one is what we call an echoic onlooker. So now the onlooker might be like holding their mouth, like signaling as if they got hit because they are echoing the event that actually is happening to somebody else. So now you might see the onlooker be able to derive an inference that the person they're seeing got hit, right? At that moment, even though you're not seeing the actual event happening. So all of these are a range of explicit pattern techniques that's telling you something's happening. I mean, you could get even more elaborated. So things like blood splatter. Now you have something that's metonymic of the event of being punched, but it's not showing you the actual event itself. So it's giving you a pointer to the event, but it's related to the event. So that's a metonymic one. Or you could have a metaphoric thing. You now show an explosion, right? It's not a literal explosion. It's now that the explosion is a metaphor for the event happening. These are all conventionalized, patterned ways that people use to not show you certain things to force you to derive an inference. So the key thing there is that inferences are not just arising by happenstance. They are marked by structural properties that are inherent to the visual vocabulary and grammar of visual narratives that are conventionalized over time, and people use these conventions. They don't know they're using them as conventions most of the time, but that's what they're doing. They're using these, and they're structurally marked as a particular part of a visual narrative grammatical sequence as peak panels. Okay, so that on the part of memory, you clearly have to do some sort of memory processes then if you are given information that you then need to retrieve information that was not given to you. In the case of something like an action star where you know event happens here, but you don't know what it is, you are going to be searching for access of meaning, but you may not be necessarily tying it to memory processes yet because you just don't know what the outcome is going to be. But at the subsequent panel, you absolutely are going to be doing memory-based processes in searching through your prior information in order to fill in what was missing, right? Yep. There has been some interesting studies related to memory, for example, one by Joe Magliano, where they start a bridging inference sequence. Then they make people do these memory tasks. And then afterwards, they get the next part of the sequence, and then they show that the memory tasks do or do not impair the subsequent ability to generate an inference. And there, the memory tasks for a purely visual narrative, both memory tasks related to verbal and visual working memory seem to impair the ability to make an inference. So then they thought, well, that's really interesting because even though there's no words going on here, the verbal working memory seems to be affecting visual inference generation, which shows some sort of connectedness in the memory-based processes. This is recently critiqued. So there's a follow-up that was done by Zhao et al., if I remember correctly, who then showed no effect of memory-based processes like these in these contexts. There was a recent dissertation that was just defended a few weeks ago. I admittedly was on the committee for assessing it by a guy named Dan Matkin, who critiqued these methods a little bit in their manner of assessing working memory. And he looked not at inference-related conditions specifically, but other visual narrative processing in the context of both verbal and visual working memory. He found no effects of verbal working memory whatsoever in the just general processing of visual sequences, so not in the cases of inference, but did find effects of visual working memory. And so in there, the argument is, well, you use visual working memory as part of your processes. He, though, didn't target these cases of inference. So it could just be that the visual working memory that he's looking at is, well, your ability to negotiate through the visual spatial aspects of the representations rather than the memory representations that you're using to search through, say, a situation model or a mental model for retrieving event information that is not forthcoming to you. So that part is a little bit unresolved. When we did this with ERPs, what you see is at the what we compared was event sequences like, just to use the example again, like the punch panel as a critical panel, an action star, and what I called a noise panel, which was basically I took an action star and I scrambled all of the representations. So it's no longer this conventionalized representation, but it has the same visual similarity values. And in fact, it's the same as the punch panel in its visual complexity. And there what you see is with ERPs, a larger N400, which would be associated with semantic memory, activation of semantic memory, for both the action star and the noise panel. So that is, you're not seeing meaning, but you're suddenly getting meaning-based processes for both of these panels. But in subsequent time windows, the action star, if I remember this correctly, it's several years ago, the action star resolves to be more similar. No, the noise panel evokes an anterior positivity that's similar to what you get for unexpected lexical items, but the action star generates a posterior positivity that's more similar to what you would get from syntactic phenomena. So that is to say, it appears that people are integrating the action star as if it's a lexical item, but you're marking the noise panel as something that's unexpected and not familiar. However, at the next panel, so at the panel that is in our example case, the person is knocked out on the ground, the noise panel and action star both evoke a sustained negativity compared to the explicit panel. And that doesn't differ between those two. So that is, when you get subsequent information that you're going to have to look back and generate information from, it didn't matter what the convention of the technique was, you're generating an inference on the basis of that new information regardless. So the waves on those didn't really differ. And that sustained negativity in various studies at least, sustained negativities are associated with memory-based processes, say searching through a mental model with working memory-based processes or something like that. That is, if you believe that the ERPs that we're seeing of sustained negativities are the same processes as what you see in other studies. That would be, so it certainly is the case that working memory is involved in these sorts of inferential processing, but they are differentially using patterns that are conventionalized.
That's very cool.
Yeah, so one of the arguments that you're slowly building here is that the processing of the components is the same across modalities,
yes,
or is similar. And so one thing that, if I hadn't heard you speak yesterday, right, if I hadn't heard the overarching talk, I might think that, okay, then visual language is processed the same as spoken language. But in fact, I think the deeper argument is that it's not that visual processing is processed in the same way as spoken language, but that the two are processed the same, you could also say that spoken language is processed in the same way as visual language.
Yeah.
Right. So in the sort of a naive listener, if I had listened to this before yesterday, I would think that you're trying to elevate or just say that the capacity to understand visual language is bootstrapped off of spoken language.
Right.
But I think more importantly, you're making the argument that they're both just built on the same thing, that
Yes.
there's no... Right.
Yes, that's correct. So one of the ways I try to describe this is in other talks, I usually say this explicitly, something like, I'm not saying that visual languages are analogous to spoken languages or that visual languages rely on spoken language representations, but rather the argument is that both visual and spoken languages are drawing on the same set of cognitive resources in equivalent ways. There's no analogy going on. They are both stemming from common neurocognitive origins and making use of those resources in ways that are optimized for the affordances of those different modalities. This may or may not yield the same brain areas operating for both of them, right? So in the case of semantic memory, the argument is that the contemporary view of semantic memory seems to be that there's like a supramodal hub that is the stuff of, the way I usually put it is, the stuff of meaning is not the stuff of modalities. So there's not really such a thing as visual meanings versus verbal meanings. There are just semantic features in a giant network of meanings, and visual representations access those meanings in different ways than verbal representations. Now, by necessity, that will cut up the semantic features in slightly different ways because of what incoming signal you have. But that doesn't mean that those slices, let's call them, are reflecting visual versus verbal concepts. It means that the visual stimulus is slightly differently activating conceptual representations than a verbal stimulus, right? So a good example, again, is something like, let's say you have the word cat. Cat is going to activate a category of cat that implicitly is going to activate a network of concepts related to what cats look like, how they feel, what they sound like, etc. Okay, now let's say you see a picture, a drawing of a cat. Now, the drawing of a cat is going to be very explicitly activating the what cats look like, what sort of visual features they have, but it's not going to necessarily activate the category information explicitly. That might be implicitly activated. But the same parts of the network are going to be activated whether implicitly or explicitly, depending on the nature of the signal that you're getting. That doesn't mean that it's this part is the verbal and this part is the visual. What you see in, again, going to ERP research, you see, for example, the same brain response, the N400 effect is elicited no matter what meaning is going on. It's always the same. The distribution on the scalp ends up being slightly different. So things like pictures end up having a slightly wider and more anterior distribution of the N400 than words, which tend to be more posterior and or parietal-ish. However, now one could say, but that's now evidence that there's a modality difference. Okay, but it turns out that there's also distribution differences by the nature of the words or pictures. So if you have dimensions of, say, concreteness versus abstractness in words, well, the abstract words tend to be more posterior and the concrete words tend to be more anterior and widely distributed. And the same thing I've observed in ERPs to pictures, of the more abstract picture representations tend to have more posterior activation of N400. So that distribution difference may relate to the types of semantic features that are being activated, not about the signal that is activating them, right? So that's on the N400 meaning side. On the side of, say, combinatorial processes or grammatical processes, we also observe similar ERP effects for the manipulation of sequences of images as we do for sequences of words. So if you manipulate the grammar of, within my model, the grammar of visual sequences, and you do the same manipulations as you do in studies of psycholinguistics, you get the same brain response. Now, again, though, the question is that same brain response the identical patch of neurons being activated? Are they adjacent neurons? Are they overlapping neurons? Is it like semantic memory where you have a supermodal hub, and then it depends which things are connecting to it that provide which activation patterns? Or are there specific neurons devoted to specific combinatorial systems that have been built up over time for particular things? You see the same thing in music also, for example. So the idea would be, maybe the neurons that are related to syntax are right next to the ones that are related to music, which are next to the ones related to visual narratives. But it's ultimately all part of the same cognitive functional area. It's just being divided in different ways that are then devoted to the different things that end up being connected to it. That, I think, is an open question. You get different results from different studies when particularly people have been looking at this with music and spoken languages. My upcoming grant project is actually aiming to look at exactly this question, but we're doing it with language, music, and visual narrative sequences. And I would say no matter what way it falls out, though, again, how you interpret that in terms of social value depends kind of on things independent of science, right? So you could say, well, in order for this to be really truly thought of as being the same system, it must be the exact same patch of neurons. But on the other hand, you might say, well, it doesn't really matter whether they're overlapping or not, because they're all obeying the same functional principles anyways. And it's unimportant whether they are doing that in terms of how we categorize that, because that's a different issue involved. And I originally, when I started on this research, I think I took the first view, which was, well, it has to be the same brain area and the brain, same overlapping brain stuff, and that would be evidence that this is truly visual languages, and then that's how we would define and gain validity of this perspective. I don't think I believe that anymore. I think that it really doesn't matter because the building blocks are the same regardless of how you treat them. The brain responses are at least similar, if not the same response, if not the same patch of neurons. And so the brain is clearly treating these things the same way and operating across them the same way. It doesn't matter, I think, whether or not it's the exact same neurons doing the work. And if you have a view on the scope of what the system is that better allows for this and says, actually, all of these things belong to a broader holistic architecture anyways. It's not that graphics are independent from music, which is independent from speech. And thus, so if they are independent, then it makes it more significant for you to say, oh, they're all independent, but they share this common cognitive architecture, right? Then that's really wild, right? However, if your baseline is, well, actually, all of these are subparts of a larger, broader architecture to begin with, then the question of whether or not they share the same neural architecture within that broader system becomes less important, because the broader system is the broader system as it is, regardless of how it's allocating the specific neural resources, despite them being probably at least overlapping or adjacent processes. So that sort of categorization, I think, when you change the overarching view on what the system is to begin with, it yields different insights onto how you're then going to treat the interpretation of the neural effects. I still think it's an important question to ask about the degree to which you're overlapping processes purely from a neurocognitive perspective. But I think that the social and the categorization issues are less mandated for the inferences you draw about those systems. And you can go about those sorts of things in a different way.
Yeah, that's intuitively very satisfying, I would say, in that you look at somebody's map of meaning as something like, water that you can pour into different teapots, but the modalities sort of give shape to what it is. You can't really understand what somebody's conception of cat is unless you understand what their conception of cat is in multiple modalities. Would you agree with something like that?
Yeah, I think to some degree. And if everything has to be filtered through the lens of spoken language, which is what many people tend to do in thinking about what meaning is it has to be filtered through this. So one of the things we get is when people see our experimental results, oftentimes we get reviewers who say, well, are people simply subvocalizing their understanding of the visual narrative? To which we say, well, here's all this evidence that says that they're not subvocalizing anything, and it's not important. But for those people, all meaning has to be filtered through the lens of spoken language. And I think that it's simply a limitation of the conceptualization of what language is in the first place, and what meaning is, and how meaning works in a way. And so if you want to have a really broader view of concepts in general, you have to incorporate a variety of different ways in which concepts are formed, which both has to do with expressive systems, that is, the way in which we are able to produce meaning through codified expressive forms, and the way we do this without any sort of expression whatsoever, right? So clearly there's ways that I'm understanding the world through visual perception that have nothing to do with the way that I can then produce things that have things. And I would clearly think that other animals have concepts, whether or not they're able to produce those concepts. You might argue about the range of categorization that they have relative to humans. That's perfectly valid. Or whether having expressive systems enables you to scaffold more complex concepts. That's something that's been argued since Vygotsky at the very least, if not more. And I think that's a perfectly valid way of looking at things as well. But yeah, if you're going to ask what are concepts to begin with, you have to address it from numerous points of view rather than simply one modality alone. And again, modalities are not the same as sensory systems. So you have to address meaning from various sensory systems as well as from different modalities being something that's producible and in addition to perceivable.
Yeah, the idea that language allows us to sort of build concepts in a very complex way is very appealing. And then, but you get this thing where when you think about it and your experience with visual language, you realize that there's also a lot of complexity there, that there's a lot of efficiency achieved also when you use visual language to communicate, which I think earlier on was not as intuitive for me because of the efficiency of language. But then I was a big comic book nerd growing up. And so I think more and more thinking about visual language, which I think is what introduced me to your work earlier, was just what you can achieve, all the things that you're achieving through the visual medium.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, if we can take one step back, you had a great example of, it was a 5-panel thing with a phone ringing. Could you walk us through that?
Sure. Yeah. Let me first say, also, I think that the contribution of graphics to just general everyday society is appreciated relative to the lauding of spoken languages oftentimes and written languages. And I raised this point the other day as well, but if you look around you, wherever you are who might be listening to this, you're bound to be sitting on chairs, seeing furniture, wearing fashion, using technology of a variety of sorts. Those things were not designed by somebody typing out a written language description of what those things are. All of them had some graphically produced design in order to specify what they look like, how they're engaged, how they operate. Oftentimes multimodal combinations of text and images, but there's certainly images. Now, after the fact, you no longer see those drawings. You just see objects, but they all happen because of the capacity to draw, not the capacity to speak. So oftentimes the contribution of graphics to society goes unrecognized. And when people then talk about the contributions of graphics, they think about, well, there's street signs and there's bathroom signs and things like that. And that's what visual culture means, as opposed to drawings being the kind of underlying structure of everything that you interact with, whether it is technology, urban landscaping, the design of homes and buildings, and all of these things all started as drawings first. Okay, so on the example that you want me to talk about, so the first panel shows a office building. The second panel shows a person sitting at a desk at the office building. The next panel shows a house. The next panel shows a person sitting at a table with headphones on. And sorry, I should have said before, in the second panel, so again, office building, and then the second panel shows a person in an office building making a phone call.
And the cool thing is, not even in the office building, just a person at a desk making a phone call.
Yeah, person at a desk making a phone call.
You pointed out that they just make the inference.
You infer that person is in the office building. Nowhere does it show it to you whatsoever. Then you see a house. Then you see a person at a table who has a cell phone that's ringing, but they're wearing headphones and they don't hear it. Again, you infer that person is in the house, but nowhere does it specify that. The next panel shows it ringing even louder. They don't hear it. And then in the last panel, you again see the person sitting at the desk hanging up the phone. So the inference of the whole sequence is that a person at an office building is calling a person in a home who doesn't hear it. And so then the person in the office building hangs up. So there's various inferences that are made about who is in the home versus who is in the office building. None of that is explicit in any sort of way. That's all structurally derived. And then there's additional structure that is persisting throughout the sequence in terms of embedding levels and things like that, and connections. So one, for example, is that the person who is calling in the second panel then hangs up in the sixth panel, and that's a distance dependency. And you could delete the entire middle section of the person who doesn't hear the phone in the house. All three of those panels could be omitted, and you still need to connect the person who is calling to the person hanging up across a distance. So that requires some sort of structure that allows you to do that distance, which is, again, one reason why sequential images are not simply moving panel to panel in making inferences across each adjacent panel. You have to have some mechanism to do long distance dependencies and connect panels. And you could make that distance even further. It could be you show the person in the house who doesn't hear the phone ringing. They get up to the fridge. They get a sandwich. They make a sandwich. They eat a sandwich. They watch a TV show. They walk the dog, come back home, and then the person hangs up the phone in the last panel. No matter how long that middle sequence gets, you're always going to need a connection between the guy calling and the guy hanging up, right? So there's always going to need to be some sort of distance dependency there, no matter how big that embedded clause gets, which means you have to make that distance connection, which is exactly the sort of thing that people have talked about in terms of syntax in language for decades.
Yeah, not to continue to kind of beat the point to this, but I think one interesting thing also is that, if you were to show the house and the phone ringing and then another person in a supermarket, you would assume that that's their home and they're just not home, they're at the supermarket. And so there's this cool thing of you can continually nest concepts, and then it's just a matter of how much memory you're expecting the individual to have. You could that would be like a third layer of nesting, but by the time you get to 6 or 7, you're doing the favor to your reader and not continually nesting things.
Yeah, so you could imagine there being something like you show the office building and the person making a call, then you show the house and the person with the phone ringing once. Then you show a close-up of the phone. You show circuits inside the phone. Then you go back out to the person not hearing the phone and the person hanging up the phone. So that would be a third level of nested information where the phone becomes a locative for that structural, embedded clause, which would then have 3 levels of embedding, right? And it's also interesting that locative information alone isn't just a locative in that way. So the house and the building there are what I call orienters, and you can nest orienters also. So you can have a sequence of 3 orienters, let's say, where you show outer space, the Earth, and then the office building, and then the person inside it. Well, now you have an embedding of orienter inside of orienter inside of orienter. But that's not the only possibility that you can have. Let's say instead you have, you see a city street, you see the office building, and you show a clock tower in a city, right? All of those are still place and scene setting information of the orienter of the place, but they're not embedding, right? Because the street is not superordinate to the buildings, which is superordinate to having the clock inside of it. So that ends up being a flat structure of orienters, which as a group serve as an orienter that provides the locative information for the man inside the building, let's say, right? So there's different possibilities of how you embed the same categories. And what ends up happening is you have, again, structural variation. So the ones that I just described of the street, the building, and the clock tower, you could rotate the order of those around, and it wouldn't matter for the locative information. But if you had outer space, Earth, and the building, if you rotate those around, you would have some weird effects where, for example, having the building before outer space or Earth would be strange, right? So you're essentially rendering that as a flat structure, but they have a difference in superordinate scope, and so that might be unusual. So you would essentially be breaking your nesting structure. And that's, again, the same sort of thing you would find in linguistic structures, where sometimes they have flat structures and sometimes they have embedded structures. And it somewhat depends on the structural relationships between those elements that are involved for how you evoke those different things. It also ends up being weirder that you can do that inside the sequence as well. So you could do something like you have the office building, the guy calling, then you show, a continent, and then you show a city, then you show the house, and then you show the person inside of it. Now you have a multiply nested orienter structure embedded inside of the larger structure of the house, the office building, man, and then this nested structure. But you could do the same sort of flat structure there. So you could have embedded, again, it would be office building, man calling, then you have street sign, park, house, and then person inside. Now that's a flat structure of orienters that have a singular orienter locative that's orienting for that person in the house. But they are only in the house part of it. The rest of it is environmental information that's associated environmental information. So there are these different constraints on how you embed which things and where.
Yeah. Because I work on learning mechanisms, one of the cool things that we see is that children are able to hierarchically categorize concepts predictably roughly around the age of 7 or 8. So before that, they fail. So if you have them play something like a 20 questions game and they have to identify one option from a set of possibilities, they're not quite able to ask informative enough questions to rapidly identify the subject. And when you ask them to identify categorical hierarchies through images, they continue to fail. So I'm wondering, I had never really thought about within the lens of comic books in general, but I wonder, if a child sees outer space, Earth, office building, person, I wonder if they're interpreting it that way. I don't know if you have the answer for that, but just wanted to put that to you.
That's a good question. I have no idea for those particular cases about the degree of nestedness across what they would be interpreting. That'd be a very interesting question to ask of children interpreting sequential images. What I can say is that children do not understand sequential images for free. And there's a developmental trajectory by which children begin to understand a sequence of images as a sequence. So the general trajectory seems to be something around like by age, 1 and 2, the kids are recognizing what graphically depicted objects are, and possibly the events that they are doing. So doggy run, things like that, and then. But they are not able to connect reference across sequential images. So they don't know that the dog in this panel is the same as the dog in this other panel. They would see those as different dogs doing different events, and thus those different panels show different depicted scenes. And this is what I call the continuity constraint. So when kids are able to actually make referential connections across panels, that's the first step, and then they are usually either simultaneously or similarly amount of time able to then make inferences about what the differences are between those images. So, well, in this panel, that is this dog, and in the next panel, it's the same dog, and in this panel, they are standing, but now they are running, and that says to me that the dog goes from standing to running. Those are developmental steps that need to be undertaken by children. And children usually don't get that continuity constraint until between ages of 4 and 6. So they're not understanding a sequence as a sequence truly with that sort of referential continuity, until about age 4 to 6. I just had the taste of this. I have a 2-year-old at home. And I'm not allowed to experiment on him, but I at least do some observations. And I had the first hint that he can't do continuity because we have a storybook. So he loves books, loves picture books, as many kids do. And he points things out to you. And in this book, there's a rabbit that draws a picture. And in the picture, there's a part where the rabbit finishes the drawing, and in the text it says, and the picture is done. And my kid knows the word done. So he goes, done, and points at the done picture because he knows that the picture is done there. And then on the next page, it repeats that finished drawing because it's continuing with the story. And my child is bilingual in both English and Dutch, and in Dutch, ook is also or to. And he blends English and Dutch. It currently hasn't really separated them out. And so he goes, on the one hand, done, and then he goes, ook done. And then on the next page, he goes, ook done, ook done. So he's seeing that these are also done. All of these are also done, which is an indication that it's not the same thing. And he does the same thing when he dips his finger in yogurt. So he'll dip his finger in yogurt, and then he'll go, one. But then he'll dip another finger in yogurt, and he'll say, ook one. And another finger, ook one, right? So he's saying also this one, also this one, also this one. And he's doing the same thing with the pictures. So he's not necessarily saying, oh, that's done, and now it's the same one continuing along. He's saying, oh, those are also done, right? And so that's the first hint I had for him specifically, that he does not have continuity yet. And, I'm not going to be experimenting, but I'll be at least observing when it does seem to be doing this, right?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, it also makes me think of sort of number cognition and sort of 1 knowers versus 2 knowers and 3 knowers. If you can sort of map on this understanding of continuity with the development, the acquisition of numbers. And it's this interesting thing that, once most animals just reach kind of 3 knowing, humans reach 4 knowing, and once you reach knowing the number 4, you kind of are able to blast off and know every other number. So do you think that the development of continuity, like once your child understands 2, do you think that's the first step in understanding that, okay, maybe the drawing is the same?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So I think, so part of the challenge of development is lots of things are happening all at once, layered on top of each other, and they're simultaneously happening. It's hard to always know what may or may not be interacting with other things, right? Which makes it very difficult to tease these things apart, oftentimes in studies of development. And I can come back to that on certain points related to things like theory of mind, for example. I can comment on. In the case of understanding continuity, I don't think that it has a connection to numerical cognition because we have also evidence that there are people who simply never get continuity. These are people who basically have never been exposed to Western visual narratives in order to understand Western visual narratives. So I have a whole book about this, which is called Who Understands Comics? And the whole point of that book, it was originally, I did it as a review paper, and that review paper did get published, but the original draft of it was really long. And the reviewers pointed out, this is way too long for being a good review paper. And I realized, yeah, you're right. So I vastly pared down the review paper and then expanded the original thing into being a book. So the overall question of the book was, there's a presiding assumption that understanding a sequence of images you get for free with perception and event cognition, and that sequential images are largely transparent, which is why we use them in contexts of education and humanitarian efforts. Those people don't have language, so let's bring a comic for them to understand these concepts. It's why people use them in experimental tasks with children, also in various populations of neurodiversities. There's a widespread stereotype that verbal information is harder to understand, but visual information is perfectly fine. This is what my colleague calls the visual ease assumption. All of those assumptions are actually at odds with what you find in the empirical literature. So in this book, I went through various dimensions by which people actually don't necessarily understand a sequence of images. So one of those is cross-cultural studies, usually with people who are not exposed to visual narratives for one reason or another. Western visual narratives, sometimes it might be that they have their own systems that operate differently than sequential images. So they're fluent in their own graphic systems, but not in the system. That's a cross-linguistic difference of visual languages, I would say, as opposed to a pure proficiency difference. There's also cases of people who just simply have not been exposed to any graphic systems such that we know of, at the very least not been exposed to Western visual narrative systems. Whether or not they have their own system is not forthcoming by a lot of these studies, and they simply don't understand it. For a long time, I was amassing a collection of personal communication references from various researchers who told me, I had sequential images. We tried to use them with a task with X people in X place who were in a very rural society, blah, 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 and they simply didn't understand them. And so we never published the study because it was a quote-unquote failed task. But really what it is it's a failed task because they're trying to use a language that those people don't understand. And then those results never get published also because, and people never realize that there's these proficiency differences. So I essentially compiled them dating back to studies from like the 60s and more so of places where people didn't understand a sequence of images or were said to say, treat each image as its own scene is one of the things that they describe it as. So there's a widespread, that's part of the phenomena. Children is another one. One of the things that I did was compiled studies that use visual narratives as stimuli for a variety of different cognitive tasks. They claim to be studying theory of mind, sequential reasoning, temporal reasoning, discourse, a range of different things that they're using sequential images as the stimuli for studying this other aspect of cognition. And then what you do is if you simply take the results that they have and compile those results across studies and average them together for, usually it's on a 0 to 1 scale of some sort of accuracy of a mean. If you compile them together, you get a very clear by age trajectory for the results, where essentially the implication is that I would say those studies are probably not studying any of the things that they claim to be studying. What their results are actually showing is visual narrative proficiency. That is a by age development of these children who are exposed to visual narratives but are progressing in their ability to understand those sequential images. And so any of the studies that are with children or even adults sometimes using comic strips to study theory of mind are very fraught because those children might not be proficient at understanding the sequence of images to begin with. And so the results are actually not telling you about anything about theory of mind. They're simply telling you about visual narrative comprehension. And then there's a bunch of other areas that I go through, things about different neurodiversities and variance of proficiency amongst people who are proficient at understanding comics. We show that all the time in all of our studies. We have a covariate that we use that assesses their visual language fluency. We find it correlates with reaction times, brain responses, eye movements, all sorts of measures of behavior and neurocognition that are picking up on variance of proficiency levels. So all of that speaks to you don't get this for free. It requires some degree of proficiency, and we have to be sensitive to that.
Yeah. Do you think that there's something about the simultaneity of visual access? So if in a children's book, I have the whole spread is one scene, and then I flip the page, and then it's one scene again. Do you think that's easier for children to grasp than the segmenting off on the same page of multiple panels? Like, is it easier to understand that there's continuity if it's flipped and I don't have simultaneous access to the same character multiple times?
That's a good question. So that's an issue of layout, essentially, right? Yeah. So of whether or not seeing the same character in a spatial array yields scaffolding for continuity or not. I'm not sure. So in some cases, picture books, like you said, you have a 2-page spread that is your entire scene. You turn the page, you get another 2-page spread. Sometimes each individual page is its own scene. Mm-hmm. So in the rabbit book that I talked about, each page has a different scene on each page. Sometimes actually you get 3 scenes spanning across the 2 physical pages. And so you get 3 rabbits on that, but they are, supposed to be progressive states. But, I don't think my child realizes this. He just sees, there's 3 rabbits.
Right.
Whether or not the juxtaposition of those elements spatially helps you get to understanding them as having continuity, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the optimal conditions are versus others. If you think about the demands on those different layouts, right? If you have one page that has one scene, and then you turn the page and you see a new scene with things, in order to have continuity, it's going to require more working memory, to come back to the working memory part, because now you have to make co-reference across 2 pages of which you just have to remember what came before, right? And we can speak to the working memory processes of little children engaged in that also, right? Versus, now I have 2 pages that are next to each other that both show me the same entity. Well, now you don't need to have the working memory doing the functioning of the callback to the previous example because you see them in front of you. So that might, like it implied, scaffold it easier because now at least you're seeing them in front of you. But at the same time, it might also be, well, if I'm seeing them in front of me, those are clearly different things, right?
Yeah.
So why should those 2 things next to each other be different states when, even though they look similar, maybe it's just, 2 different bunnies that are next to each other. Or even if it's the same identity, why should those 2 images be connected? They're next to each other. Like it looks like one big picture. So maybe it's just one big picture, right? So recognizing the unitization of those different states is then a challenge for how you would recognize it. So I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah.
That's something that is, if, part part of the deal is people have not actively studied this as a domain to tease apart these issues in the same way that we've studied things like spoken languages or even sign languages. Part of it is you can't do that research until you have a theoretical framework that tells you that you need to, like, here's how you need to tease it apart, right? So most of the developmental work I have cobbled together from studies that are usually looking at things that are not explicitly this. Now, there's some that are looking at these, right? But a lot of times you find the data because people intended to look at theory of mind, but in fact they were looking at visual narrative proficiency, and then you can make the inferences about what they're actually showing, what their results actually show given their stimuli and the participants. If we actually start devoted research to looking at these issues, to look at those issues specifically and build a research program and field the way that other aspects of behavior look at, then you can start asking these very specific questions of things like, well, how does the layout affect children's ability to start inferencing of these things? And you need to like inventory the children's books and what books children are reading and when, and what, and how that's facilitating different things. And then you can actually get at this the same way you would with any other psycholinguistic study of language acquisition.
Yeah, it's really cool, because one of the things that was coming to mind is, if you flip the pages fast enough, you have a movie, right? So if you put a flip book in front of a child and you flip it, that sort of illusion that the thing's actually moving. So I wonder if that would help them get the sort of visual fluency with the idea that you flip pages and it's the same thing. But then if I actually flip them fast enough where I don't actually get the sensation of pages being flipped, but I just see the images unfolding in front of me, if that'll help them then scaffold on to...
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I do know that for adults that are not exposed to visual narratives and also not exposed to film, most of the continuity aspects are not an issue in film, across film shots. They're able to understand, that person is the same as that person because they're people. They're not. You don't have to decode the graphic representation across static representations. They're moving people, and that's fine. I know the same things. The things that they have more trouble with are the inferences, like the locative. Here's a house, and then there's people. Right. They might not know the inference that people are in that house when only you see an exterior of a house and then people inside. They might not get that inference. The one case where there was signs of a continuity error was in this example where this is interpretations of people from a Turkish village who had never seen videos and then were exposed to them, and then they looked at what the things they had more, I don't want to say difficulty, but they construed in different ways. And the only thing that hinted of continuity issues was they showed a shot of a cow, and then they showed a shot of the same cow from a different viewpoint. And then some people said those were two cows. And I think it's because of the range of viewpoints that they showed them from, and that they didn't necessarily realize that it was, repetition, and why would you repeat the same thing across, Right. So there was only this one case of presumed continuity issues compared to generally they're fine with the continuity issues, and it's just the higher order things that they have more challenges with.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about sort of early animators, when in Walt Disney, kind of frame by frame, painstakingly adding in the minutia of change. And they're basically working on frame rate, right? Like a high frame rate, but they're drawing it.
Yeah.
And so if you leave these gaps, there's some critical threshold at which children go from understanding it to the frame rate being low enough where they no longer understand the continuity.
Right.
And so that seems really interesting.
Yeah, and animation is an interesting question of, I don't think necessarily children have problem with continuity in film, even animation, across shots. And I think that there we get back to the layout issue, is that if you have a moving object that is moving in a singular space, even if it's across shots, it's less hard to make the continuity connection than across spatial representations that have no movement, where you have to decode the graphic array and then connect it to another static spatial array. And it's worth remembering, of course, that animation has only been around for 100 years or so, other than with rotoscopes and like these spinning things that give you the illusion of motion or something. But usually it's just that you have static representations across sequences. So the ability just to do this is a fairly new thing that then makes it more like perceivable, representations that are moving.
And the interesting thing is that the verbal narrative is constant. So with a child, the parent is continuously sort of unspooling this continuous verbal narrative. The pictures are changing, but then there's still a gap. So that's an interesting sort of thing where the children are perceiving something which ostensibly is the same story and has a consistent verbal narrative, but the images could seem like they're not part of that.
Possibly, but there's also the question of to what degree children are understanding the verbal narrative as a narrative at all.
Sure.
So mostly children seem to get narrative understanding much later, I think around 5, 6 even, maybe earlier, but something later. Before that, they're generally getting a linear sequence of event understanding, which is one of the reasons why studies and observational studies of children's preferences of videos is often that little children are not really caring about watching stories, but they might be perfectly fine watching here's a bunch of successive images of different animals or
Planet Earth,
Planet Earth, list-like functions, right? Or just watching other people doing actions that are not necessarily story-driven, because the story structure part isn't necessarily something that they're scaffolding. And there's many reasons why children might enjoy reading picture books, right? It might be, and if you look at the structure of a lot of picture books, especially for young children, a lot of them are lists of things. Here's a bunch of different events that are happening, or here's a list of different animals that are in different places. Here's things, but they aren't necessarily having a beginning, middle, end of a story per se, right? It could be that the children just there's many reasons to why children would like having a story read to them and or engaging it with themselves. It might be that they just like experiencing the visual language as an exposure to these things. They might like the intimacy of sitting on a parent's lap and engaging with communicative material. They might just like the overall setting of all of it. So there's a number of things that might be motivating it that is not just I really like this story, right? And children oftentimes, mine included, like hearing the exact same story over and over and over again, which again might not be that they like that particular story. It might be they like, I really like that one image in it, and I like the way that my parent delivers this and has this experience. And then, there's any number of reasons why they might be into one thing or another of this experience that is not necessarily about the content as we fully fledged understanding adults might be like, well, this is a compelling story. It might just be that there's all sorts of reasons why young children might like something or not, right? Even if they're not able to understand it the same way that we understand it.
Yeah. So if we can kind of turn on to you real quick.
Sure.
What got you into this work?
I fell into it backwards. I actually never intended to even go to college. I was drawing comics since I was a small child. I started working in the American comic industry when I was a teenager. So I used to work at booths at Comic-Con for Image Comics when I was 14, starting when I was 14.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I was kind of on the inside of the American comic industry from a very young age. And my intention was simply to draw comics as a professional. And then I was kind of talked into going to college just so I wouldn't, miss out on it. I was always a good student, so it wasn't like it was a question of whether I could get into college or something like that, or even a good college. And so, but I kind of went just because I was like, well, I'll go because I think it'll be a good experience and whatnot, because I just intend to draw comics still as my career path. And so I went to college and studied what I wanted to, which was Asian studies with a focus on Japan and Buddhism. Mm. And while I was there, by chance, I took classes on linguistics because my roommate was taking a class on linguistics and was like, hey, you should take this class with me. And I was like, all right, that sounds fun. And my mindset was, well, I am still doing this to enrich my knowledge and ability to create comics. So and in my hubris, I thought, well, I know everything about the graphic part, but I don't really know anything about the verbal part, so I'll take linguistics. And I was always very theoretically minded, even in my comic creation stuff. So I was always thinking about the structures and how they related and things like that, usually through a lens of practice of how to create comics rather than analyzing them. But I thought, okay, I'll take this linguistics class. So then I took this linguistics class, and I started realizing that, well, all the same sort of constructs they're talking about in the structure of language are what I am understanding is going on in the structure of graphics. Wow. And then I just kind of kept probing deeper, and I didn't find a robust literature explaining these things. In years since, I've found many different people who have made a variety of associated arguments and things like this.
Now including yourself.
No, some better arguments than others, but there was not any sort of robust literature or coherent literature, and certainly not going about it with the same way that I had in mind. And then I started thinking, well, now I'm kind of more interested in these sorts of questions than I am in even creating the comics. And so I just kind of shifted gears to and kept pursuing these questions than I did through graduate school and beyond. And I was just kind of interested in doing this because I thought I had some interesting things to reveal about it. And my methodology turned out to be highly novel compared to the way other people were going about these questions. And the view on things as being part of a broader, like, multimodal architecture, of which I would say the visual language work is a subsection of a broader architecture. I actually had that framework since the very beginning. So the broader view has been my default view for 20 plus years. It's just that I haven't been articulating that in publications as much until recently. Because you can only bite off so much at a time. And if you're already making what I think could be considered a fairly radical argument that graphics have the same principles and properties and cognition as other languages, that's enough of an argument beyond just, well, actually, they're all subparts of one bigger system. And so I've kind of had it to like reveal the properties of these systems piece by piece. And now everything is kind of out in the open in a certain way. But the broader view has always underlied everything that I've done. And I think that's one of the differences between the sort of work that I've done and the comparisons that other people have made across modalities is that there is a difference in the paradigmatic assumptions that I have from the start about what the system is and how it's built that motivate all of it, rather than simply making an analogical comparison of saying, well, visuals are like verbal information, and all the assumptions that you have about verbal information can maintain as they are, and you're simply just now making an analogy to the visuals. And I'm saying, well, actually, you have to reconsider the structure of all of it. That if visuals are like the verbal, well, the verbal also, how you think about the verbal also has to be changed. And you have to take seriously what all of the modalities are telling you as indications of what a broader system might be, even for reconsidering the way the vocal modality is operating for spoken languages, has to bear in mind the insights that we gain from looking at other modalities also, because ultimately they're not separate systems entirely. They're not as independent as people treat them to be.
Yeah, right on. I've been writing and performing poetry for a long time as well, and it's an interesting thing to see how when you perform the poem, there's so much information that you're adding through your body. If you're actually performing and not just reading the poem. And it's interesting how some of my favorite, say, poets are people that can convey all of the same information somehow with just language as they would with language in their body. And so there's this interesting thing of mastering your modality in a way that almost invokes other modalities, in that you can sort of visually imagine both the person narrating it to you and then also, say, the sequence of concepts as images. And so I guess that to me is always really an interesting thing of how, you can listen to somebody even narrating something like in an audiobook, and if they've mastered the art of narration, it calls up all these other modalities.
Right.
Yeah.
So I have a slightly contrary interpretation of things like that, which is, so one of the things sometimes you hear when people are opposed to using comics as literature and things like that is people say, well, but when you read a book, you get to imagine the events and things that are happening. And if you have a comic, then you don't get to have that engaging of that mental imagery and stuff. And it's similar in nature of like, well, right now people are accessing a podcast purely auditorily, presumably. And so you don't see my movements and all that stuff necessarily. And again, in poetry, whatnot, you're evoking imagery, etc. Well, if you take a default view of the communicative system as being multimodal, and that the reason we have multiple modalities is because they are there to complement each other in a broader multimodal whole, well, what you get then from pure text alone or pure auditory information alone is a degraded signal compared to the rich signal of a multimodal signal, which is the default. So it flips the expectation. So usually when people talk about multimodality, they're coming from a unimodal perspective where multimodality is value added. But if your baseline is that actually humans are multimodal animals to begin with, when you're then providing unimodal information, it's a degraded signal. So what do you do with a degraded signal is you compensate using the cognitive mechanisms that you have to fill in for the information that you're then missing. So that is to say that, well, if your default expectation is actually a desire for combining, say, text or speech with images so that you get a multimodal rich signal, and now you don't have those images, well, now maybe you're going to evoke mental imagery on the basis of filling in what would otherwise be a multifaceted signal. So it kind of flips the expectations in a lot of ways for what is normative versus not normative, and how you interpret those things.
Right, and it sort of changes the difference from, say, listening to a piece of music to then watching it being performed as not just necessarily a matter of degree, but almost a difference in kind, where you're adding a different modality, which you wouldn't, is not just embellishing the auditory experience, but is actually producing an entirely new sort of set of interpretations and experience that you can get. Does that match with how you see it?
To some degree. I mean, I think, again, it's if you set multimodality as the baseline, when you are no longer getting multimodality, you're getting something degraded, and so you might be compensating for the lack of additional information, possibly. Not all the time, but possibly, right?
Yeah.
So that is to say, when you read a purely textual book and you're evoking mental imagery, imagining the scene, it might be because the author is not giving you the visual images that your brain is desiring as a multimodal creature. And so you're compensating with mental imagery rather than simply reading a book that has both pictures and words.
That's cool.
Okay, 2 more quick questions.
Sure.
One, what are some of your favorite comic books?
What are some of my favorite comic books? Mostly I have read comics by, I tend to end up reading comics by people I know.
Okay, cool.
and or friends of mine. I've long liked the work of Xander Cannon, for example, who his last book was called Kaiju Max, which was about kaiju, like giant robots and monsters, who are then imprisoned on an island together. So it's like the Max prison.
Max prison.
And so it's kind of a prison book about kaiju, is where it ends up being, it's very entertaining, very good. I read both manga and American books usually, and some European books. I lived in Japan for a little while, so I'm proficient in Japanese. I'm not fully fluent, but I'm proficient enough and literate. And I tend to read. I'd say my favorite comic is a Japanese book called The Vagabond, which is a samurai story, which is fantastic. It's unfinished, unfortunately, and it's unclear when it might get finished, but it's phenomenal. That same author has also done a really great book called Real recently, which is about wheelchair basketball players and people with disabilities, largely. All of the characters have some sort of disabling thing that is they're experiencing, whether it's physical or mental or whatnot. But the overall frame is about basketball because he's a big basketball fan. He's the same author who did Slam Dunk. He's Inoue Takahiko is the name of the author. So I really love his work as well. So I'd say those are my favorites.
Right on. And you made some emojis?
I did make some emojis.
Yeah.
Yes. So I have been working with a partner who is the head of the emoji subcommittee for Unicode, Jennifer Daniel. And they and I have partnered making a number of emojis and emoji proposals. The ones that are, I would say I co-created that are in people's phones are the melting face emoji, the dotted line emoji, the breath face that looks like it's sighing, the shaking emoji that looks like it's shaking back and forth, and the, how to describe this one? It has the emoji that has cutesy eyes and little tears like it's about to cry, that is smiling.
Yeah,
I use
wow.
that a lot. I love it.
So I made all of those ones. And I have a couple more that are under review right now. So when they announce new emoji in the fall, maybe those ones will be part of the set. We'll see. Right. Those ones that are under consideration have actually been originally designed like 6 years ago, and we only got around to getting them out recently. At least one of them is a little bit newer. So it's something that we actively do, that I'm engaged with. It's not like I'm spending most of my time deriving emoji all over the place, but a lot of the strategy of face emoji over the last 5 years or so has been inspired by much of my work, if not directly informed by my helping create them. And some other emoji, what would you call it? Applications are also motivated by research that I did. So
there's one called Emoji Kitchen.
Yeah, Emoji Kitchen is a function on Android phones. If people have Android phones, that it's built into every Android phone. If you engage Emoji Kitchen, it allows you to select two emoji and just basically smush them together to create a new emoji. So you can have, a melting, smiling apple or something. Like if you take the apple and the melting face and smush them together, then you get a melting apple, something like that. And that I was told, I didn't know this, but I was told that was built after having read my book. So it was so there's a direct inspiration of my work on those sorts of emoji things as well. So that's a nice little claim to fame, I would say.
So you explained basically my follow-up, but it was more like process of you see a need and you think, okay, there's a need that we can fill in terms of a particular type of expression, and I can capture this in one single image?
To some degree. So one of the ways that we went about it is that the original emoji set was from Japan and drew heavily on you can call symbology or morphology of Japanese comics, of what I would call Japanese visual language. We had, and then as it became taken over by Western tech companies and whatnot, you got a proliferation of fairly odd-looking face emojis that you were not necessarily sure why they were there or not, like cowboy hat. Why is cowboy hat there, etc. Why is there very minute differences in frowns, right? Like when am I going to use that frown versus this frown? So they wanted to kind of resettle and think about, okay, well, what are the conventions that are actually going to get engaged in these different things? So when they contacted me, part of the strategy was we had inventoried a bunch of symbology from manga in our research. Nice. So we simply took that list of things and said, okay, which ones are already represented within emoji? Which ones could be represented within emoji? And we said, well, here are the best ones that could be used. Or other conventions that are not necessarily from manga specifically that could be applied that exist in visual culture already that could then be put into emoji. So the dotted line emoji, for example. Dotted lines are not hugely prevalent in manga, although they are in other types of comics to show invisibility is what it's indicating. And I thought, well, I know that this is a thing, so maybe this would be a good way to incorporate this in as a representation. So that was part of the idea. In other cases, we thought we really should have an emoji that conveys this sort of meaning because that would be important. The shaking face one is an example of this, which in the end, I don't think the shaking face is going to be used how we had originally intended it necessarily, which is when we were first thinking about it, we were thinking about natural disasters because people send emoji as quick ways of conveying what natural disasters they might be involved in, like fire, tornado, etc. And the emoji subcommittee thought, or at least Jennifer on it thought, there's not an easy way to convey earthquake. And so, because part of the problem cross-culturally is, well, you could show a shaking building, but what type of building are you going to show?
Exactly.
And then you get into questions of cultural sensitivity and various forms of buildings look different in different places. And are you going to have a million different building emojis that all look like they're shaking? Or how are you going to go about
shake the person?
Yeah, what thing? So the other side of it was, well, what if we just show up the person shaking instead of the building shaking? And then we ended up with the shaking emoji. Now, do I think that people are going to end up using the shaking person emoji in the context of earthquakes? Maybe not, even though that was somewhat of our motivation for them. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily a fail on our part, but it's a question of how it gets used. You can still use it to depict all sorts of shaking information. So that's part of it. And we've followed that with other things now with, we know we have these different graphic representations in wider visual culture. Maybe we could apply them to emoji, whether or not there's an explicit gap. Emoji won't get approved if the committee thinks it's already coverable by an existing emoji.
I see.
So it has to have some sort of niche that is not being fulfilled.
And are they also retiring some?
They are not.
Oh,
so
okay.
emoji don't get retired.
Ever-growing
it's
list.
just ever-growing list,
Wow.
which is one reason for, I think, the reason why when you now get new emoji that are released every year, the list is smaller every year, kind of. It's not like you get a huge inventory of emoji. And there's a balance. So I'm primarily doing like face emojis, the main sort of thing that I end up kind of doing. There's one that might come out that's not a face emoji that I worked on. But for other things like objects and things like that, there's a balancing act for how emoji get approved that's both about communication and also sociocultural representation. That, for a long time there was like, well, various companies are petitioning to have whatever sort of object that they happen to work on represented in emoji, whether it's their brand, usually not, because emoji won't have a brand, but It might be that, the avocado industry is going to push for an avocado emoji so that avocados are represented in emoji, right? Now, that could happen all over the place, in which case you then get, very complicated balancing act of industry and communication for what function are emoji truly conveying. Is it just, well, I want to have an emoji there so that my industry or my profession or whatever is represented, versus I need this because people are going to be better communicating with these things. And you get this also with debates. I've been interviewed about things like, should there be more medical emoji? Should you have emoji for every major body part so that doctors can use the emoji to talk with their patients better, right? And then you get into a range of complex questions about, what is the intent of the emoji set? Should there be alternative emoji sets for like the medical? Here's the medical emoji set, and here's the law emoji set for particular use cases, right? Or should it just be that there's just emoji generally, and then you have subclasses, but then how much do you want it to proliferate? And it's a complex questions for this when you have a particularly codified visual vocabulary like that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that the accessibility and the sort of cross-cultural variation is a central part of the work, and like the inclusivity, which I also see as sort of a core structure of your work as well, which is something that I really respect and appreciate.
Thank you.
Of what you're doing, sort of how it extends beyond just, okay, these are important things to know, and doesn't just make an ethical or moral argument for inclusivity, but just says this is just what it is.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that about your work.
Oh, thank you.
Perfect.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the good questions and the good discussion.